Okay, this lecture is going to wrap up chapter 10 and our discussion on personality. So let's talk about personality testing. So, why do we test or assess for different personalities? It's a tool that can be used when diagnosing psychological disorders. It's also used a lot in the business sector when selecting employees. And finally, if we're to further our understanding of personality and traits and people behaviors that people engage in, as related to these traits, then research is needed on it. So we also do testing just for the purpose of research. What we want to keep in mind as we think about the different tests that we're going to talk about is the standard of validity and reliability. So remember, validity is the extent to which the test measures what it is supposed to be measuring. And reliability is the extent to which the scores are reliable. So, can you score relatively the same each time you take a test? Are the results consistent? There are a number of ways that we can conduct personality tests. So, first, through clinical interviews or direct observations. We can use personality inventories. So these are typically surveys given to the individual and they sort of self report on their own personality. And finally, we can conduct projective tests. So this is where individuals are shown vague or ambiguous images and they're asked to respond to them. And their scores are based on their answers. So I'm going to get into the details of each one, but these are just the main three ways we can conduct personality tests. So, first, let's talk about structured or at least semi structured interviews. These consist of pre existing set of questions that are selected by the interviewer prior to the test being administered. These are often indirect or probing questions. They require the individual to talk about their attitudes or behaviors in the past tense. So, essentially talking about what has happened to them before, or they have to talk about future assumptions. So, they're asked, what would you do if, or what would you do if this happened, right? So these assume that the individual is being honest. It relies on this essentially. Unless the person is fully honest, then the test will not be valid. Because if the participant is not honest, the test no longer measures what it is supposed to measure, right? It's not valid, there's no validity. And in this case, we're trying to measure personality. But if the individual isn't honest, we're really only measuring the person's level of honesty. We're not getting to any type of measure of their personality or personality traits or behaviors. And it does make these type of tests problematic. There's actually an entire body of research that looks into the correspondence between what you do, so your actual behavior, and what you say, so how you talk about your behavior, and measuring the degree to which these things match. And overwhelmingly, that research has demonstrated that people aren't truthful. Okay. They typically respond with how they think the experimenter would want them to respond, not with the truth. Okay. So those studies show low correspondence between someone's behavior, which is what they do, and then how they talk about that behavior later on. Observational methods can also be used to rate subjects' behavior. So, from direct observations or even using a behavioral diary of keeping track of the behavior you're observing. And then their personality is inferred from the information gathered during the observation. Now, accurate rating is dependent on the amount of information the observer gathers. So, how much information they can actually get in an observing period and the accuracy of that information, whether or not they miss something, right? Is what they're recording actually accurate? It's also dependent on the observer's skill and overall experience, guys. So, if they've collected observational data before or not. Now, typically, whenever a direct observation is conducted, you want to have high inter-rater reliability. This is where you have two observers and they both observe the same behavior and take their own data, and then you compare and you see if they agree. And you want to see high agreement between them, right? So that would give you high inter-rater reliability. So this should be assessed whenever it is possible during observational methods. We use observational methods a lot in behavior analytic procedures, And we always have a second observer and inter-rater reliability. In fact, if you're going to publish in any of the behavior analytic journals, it is required that you have this inter-rater reliability. It's a tongue twister, but in order to publish, you actually have to have this on your study. And if you don't, they won't consider it for publication. So it's really important when you're conducting these observational methods to have two separate observers to make sure you have agreement between them. Because essentially, if you don't have agreement between them, then your definition of the behavior and your data that you're collecting is probably not accurate, right? But if if multiple people can watch the same instance of behavior, they can get the same data and they match, then you know that your definition of that behavior is good, right? And that the data you're taking is accurate. Okay. The next type of personality tests we can conduct are called personality inventories. So these are self-report tests that ask individuals to answer a series of questions about their own behavior. Now, the logic behind these tests is pretty simple. So no one knows you better than you. No one has known you longer than you've known yourself. And no one has more access to your private feelings than you do, right? So it makes sense to have you answer these questions about yourself. So the individual scores each answer based on a scale of some type, whether it's true or false, some sort of number Likert type scale, so 1 to 5, or scales, Likert scales, agree to disagree, or likely to unlikely, and things like that. So it's usually on a scale that you're rating. And these tests often consist of several hundred questions to increase the level of validity. So from these answers, personality profiles are produced by inputting the answers in and running various statistical analyses on the scores. Okay, so that's how we use the inventories. An example of one of these is the MMPI. This is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Test. This particular test was specifically designed originally to aid clinicians in diagnosing psychological disorders, but it's also been used to predict a variety of other behaviors as well. It measures 10 personality traits, and when manifested to an extreme degree, they're considered to be symptoms of a present disorder. It's designed so that a high score on one scale would be indicative of a specific disorder. So for example, high score on the scale of depression indicates that the individual has depression. Now, it isn't always that simple, right? It's not that because you score high, maybe on a depression scale, it means you have depression. Usually, typically, psychological disorders have any number of symptoms that are going on associated with these disorders, not just one, right? There's not just one measure that dictates whether or not a psychological disorder is present. But the test is still widely used, even though there is this sort of caveat or issue with it in terms of being a little too simplistic. The current one being used is the MMPI 20. There's about 340 questions on it, and it usually takes individuals anywhere from half an hour to almost an hour to complete. This is just a graph showing how individuals with different psychological disorders might score on the test. So the green line represents someone who has depression, and as you can see, they did score higher on the depression scale, but they're scoring really high on the hypochondriasis. They're, scoring fairly high on hysteria. So as you can see, it's not just one scale that we're looking at. You need to take sort of all of them into account. There are some potential issues with personality inventory tests in that there's a bias towards social desirability. So kind of like we talked about a little bit ago, people often respond to questions to make themselves look good, right? Not necessarily with the truth. We also see what is called response set. So this is the tendency to respond in a certain way. So maybe someone always answers no to all of the questions or always answers yes to all of the questions. Whatever makes you look better, essentially. So you get the same responses across all items. We call this response set. Now, there are measures taken to ensure that these tests are as valid as they can be and to sort of counteract these issues that can come up with them. Okay, so given the above limitations, they try to ensure their validity. So some of these tests include lie scales. They also remove any socially sensitive items. So if the item is really sensitive and objectively makes someone look bad, typically it's not going to be included to begin with because we know that people will tend to answer it to make themselves look good and not necessarily truthfully. The way in which items are worded is also varied. So if someone answers all yes, or maybe like all fives, if it's a 1 to 5 Likert scale, the test will indicate this. And the way you do this is you have negatively worded or positively worded items. So things like I would always and I would never. So they're worded positively and negatively, but you would have to answer different, at opposite ends of the spectrum. You couldn't just go through the whole test and circle all fives. When we put in the scores, we would see that you did that, right? That you just entered all fives because of those reverse worded questions that are included. Let's look at another type of personality test. These are referred to as projective tests. These are really fun. I always love talking about these. They're so weird, but they're interesting. They are interesting to talk about. These involve showing vague, ambiguous stimuli to participants and requiring them to respond in some way. And then scores supposedly reveal the participants' needs, feelings, and personality traits. So the scores based on the answers that they give. These were developed under the projective hypothesis, and this states that ambiguous materials serve as a blank slate that people can project their own characteristic concerns and conflicts onto. Okay, there's a few different types of projective tests. So first we have word association tests. This is where words are said out loud by the tester and the participants have to respond with the first word that comes to mind, another word. So if I say cold, you say some word that comes to your mind. If I say difficult, you say. If I say mountain, you say something else. So it's essentially just reading off words, and then the participant will respond with the first word that comes to mind, and then those are scored, and a personality is sort of developed from the score. Sometimes these tests can also produce physiological responses, so things like increased heart rate, temperature increase, the galvanic skin response, basically sweating. So an apparatus might be used to also measure these responses, right? Not just their word responses. And I'm not going to go into these in too much detail because they're pretty straightforward, the word association tests. But in just a moment, I am going to go into the other two type of projective tests in detail. So we have the Rorschach ink blot test. So this is where the respondent tells the therapist or tester what they quote unquote see in the ink blocks. And we'll go more into detail in just a moment on those. And the third type is thematic apperception tests. So this is where the participants are shown ambiguous pictures and they're asked to tell a story about what is going on in the picture. And then whatever the theme of their story is going to provide insight into that person's personality. Okay, so let's talk about the Rorschach ink blot test. The tester is essentially going to hold up 10 different cards with different ink blot shapes on them. And then the individual is allowed to use their imagination to decide what the shape resembles to them or what the shape makes them think of. And I've placed just a few here for you to look at and sort of contemplate. I'll pause for a few seconds, but I suggest, you pause the video if you want to really look at it and see what it makes you think of. So there's this one. There's this one. And this third one. Okay. So are there issues with this method? Yes, there are. Okay, so first, the scoring on these is largely subjective. So there's a number of different ways that these can be scored, and it depends largely in the end on the inferences made by the tester, right? Any attempts to standardize these scores in the past, and people have tried to standardize the scores and the scoring systems, they have failed, right? Testers rarely come to the same outcome or score. And part of the reason for this is because the reliability of these tests is really low, extremely low, in fact, which means individual responses and scores are not consistent across multiple test administrations. So remember, we said that for a test to have reliability, you would score relatively the same on any number of administrations of that test. But when we're talking about the Rorschach inkblot test, we get varied responses from individuals, no matter when they're, on various administrations of the test. And we also see different scores and outcomes from the testers. So there's really no standardized way. Well, there is a way to score these, and people are trained on how to do this, but it is still not a standardized score in the sense that even those who are trained on this typically do not come to the same outcome or score. Okay, so these tests are really, really low reliability. Okay, the third type of projective tests are the thematic apperception tests. So for these tests, the subject is shown a number of ambiguous pictures or scenes, and they're asked to describe them by telling a story about what is going on in the image. Now, again, scoring of these responses, much like the Rorschach ink blots, tend to be largely subjective, okay, according to the tester. So scores are not standardized. We rarely see testers come to the same score or conclusion. We rarely see participants responding the same across different administrations of the test. So reliability of these is really, really low. So overall, when we look at projective tests, proponents or supporters argue for two main strengths of the tests. They argue that they're not transparent to the respondents, which is true. These images are ambiguous or arbitrary, and the participants cannot know ahead of time how to answer them. Okay. Additionally, they argue that these may be more sensitive to the unconscious features of personality and that the participants are unaware of themselves. They're basically arguing that there is an unconscious that controls your behavior and personality, and the only way to get at that is with these sort of ambiguous pictures. But those who oppose these types of tests argue that there is minimal, if any, scientific basis to the results because we see largely inconsistent scoring, very low reliability. There are no norms or scale of normal answers. Depending on the pictures that you show, you can definitely run into cultural bias, right? So the answers that are being provided are biased towards the culture that the individual is coming from. And we also see very poor validity where the tests are actually measuring the thing they're supposed to measure, which in this case is personality. So we see poor validity, which means that the test is not measuring what it's supposed to measure. And that concludes the lectures on chapter 10. And then there are several questions that should help you for review on your exam.